Welcome to ILTV's Insider. I'm Steve Leibowitz. We are just about 6 months into the war in Gaza, 179 days, so we will soon mark the half-year mark since October 7th. Joining us today to discuss the war and more from his office in Jerusalem is David Horowitz, editor-in-chief of the Times of Israel, and from California, very early in the morning, former Knesset member Alon Tal from War Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz's blue and white Knesset faction. Guys, before we begin, and just to get us into the mood, let's listen to this brief clip from visiting American Jewish rapper Matisyahu, who released a new song, Ascent, shot at the site of the Nova Music Festival and various kibbutzim that experienced the Hamas massacre on that horrific day.
I sense my fam under attack. We used to getting shot in the back, and now the whack they want to understand. Stiff-necked son of the right hand, a fam of slaves from the sand. Just a dreamer in a foreign land. Yeah, you know we smart and mad funny. To come against the first sons, you must be a dummy.
David, we are turning to you first. We are seeing growing anti-government protests directed at Prime Minister Netanyahu's coalition. The weekly hostage family protests are now also demanding that Netanyahu go. After the terrible events of October 7th, there was an overwhelming feeling of unity in the country. Is that unity now lost 6 months later?
I think it is disappearing. The army is incredibly coherent, and I think has a unity of purpose, and it would be incredibly debilitating if that was not the case. But many of the pre-October 7th fractures have resurfaced. It's not the judicial overhaul that is dividing Israel now. It's the consequences of the policies ahead of October 7th, what happened on October the 7th, and what's been happening since. This has been a very divided country. I think there are many people who feel that the divisions pre-October 7th were part of the reason why Hamas was able to invade and carry out the horrors that it carried out. We have a very divisive prime minister, and he held it in check for some time, but as the weeks passed, he too has fostered division. We can go into that if you want the gory details, but telling a journalist who's just come back from reserve duty at the front that who had the temerity to ask him a question that, yes, he understands the media is fighting him and he's fighting Hamas, or the way he put it the other way around. I'm fighting Hamas and you're fighting me. That's just a little insight. And we have a very dysfunctional government, very bloated, hasn't done a great job of looking after people at even the most basic level, educational level, moving people from zones that have had to be evacuated. There's been a great deal of civilian volunteerism stepping into a breach left by a dysfunctional government. And then maybe finally we should add that a decades-old, utterly solvable internal Israeli issue of the entire Ultra-orthodox community, or almost all of it, not performing military or national service, which was always outrageous, and by the way, not in the traditions of Orthodox Judaism. It has come to the head again. Netanyahu is not credibly seeking to solve it in a way that imposes rights and responsibilities on the Ultra-orthodox community. And therefore, lots of division. I don't think it's entirely fair to say that the entire community of relatives of hostages are now openly allied with the returning and rising Netanyahu must go protesters, but some of them, indeed, in the last few days have allied the causes. And that's a very recent shift that, again, underlines how divided Israel is now, even as it has failed yet to definitively dismantle Hamas, and even as tensions are acute across the northern border.
Let me turn to you, Alon. I know that you just arrived in California. You'll do some more public speaking in tough times for Israel's image. Just before you left, I know that you met with Minister Gantz. He entered the government days after the start of the war and is deeply involved in the decision-making process, but with no clear post-war plan in place, no hostage release on the horizon, and a mess of humanitarian aid in Gaza. Might it not be time for Gantz to leave the war cabinet?
I think that Benny Gantz wakes up every morning and asks himself that question. Let's make a distinction between holding elections and forcing this government to face the decision of the people if they still enjoy support, and Gantz is leaving the government. Because if the Blue and White Party were to leave the coalition, it wouldn't do anything in terms of bringing the government down. What it would do, it would take the two most senior and I would say most competent military minds that are helping to minimize the damage and do the best we can in Gaza, take them out of the room. And so when I'm faced with this question, and I weighed in locally in the blue and white discussions, yes, I think it would be great. It would be terrific, and it would be responsible if the prime minister would move elections forward, recognizing that his government no longer has support. But whether or not Benny should leave the government is a separate issue. And you have the Northern Front, which is only heating up. And with all due respect to the tremendous achievements in Gaza militarily, we need to bring the citizens of the northern borders back to their homes so they can start their school year in September in a safe and reasonable position. It's untenable that 60,000 people can be left as refugees for so long. And so until that situation is resolved, and until there is a final word on the hostages, my own view is that Benny Gantz probably should stay in the government, assuming he can still be effective. Prime Minister Netanyahu is doing a lot of things to try to provide smaller and larger insults to push him out, from canceling his security detail in London, which was outrageous, to basically keeping him out of some of the key decisions. And I think at some point, Minister Gantz will be fed up.
All right, I want to turn to you, David, and I want to turn our attention to the diaspora and Israel's image. David, you were born in England before Aliyah. You've traveled many times to the U.S. and certainly Britain. There have been many bad times in terms of Israel's international image. Is this unprecedented?
Yeah, I think it's worse than that. And it's worse than that in that we were privileged, all the three of us on this program and our generations, to grow up after World War II, when one wanted to believe that anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews, had been marginalized and that the world had kind of recoiled in horror from the evidence of what human beings can do to one another. So we could talk about Israeli public diplomacy and Israel's failure to effectively articulate a narrative, which is a decades-old problem that Israel officialdom has never taken seriously. And I did an interview the other day with Elon Levy, who was probably the most charismatic, certainly, person in the public diplomacy directorate, and who basically was told to leave. He actually took the final step, but he was suspended. It's a very bizarre story. And in that interview, you get a little sense of how abidingly marginal and dysfunctional that second battlefield is in terms of people in governance. But it's not the root of the problem. The root of the problem is an intolerance for Israel in very wide circumstances that in many cases now has just become old-fashioned anti-Semitism again. And just as a little way of understanding that, October the 7th was 6 months ago, and you could say, well, growing international criticism of Israel, opposition to the war and so on. But the opposition to everything that Israel was doing to try to prevent this happening again, which Hamas says it fully intends to try and do, the opposition to any Israeli response was growing almost from the day after October the 7th, certainly in the very first few days before Israel had really begun to go about trying to respond and dismantle Hamas. There was intolerance for the very notion of Israel defending itself. And now October the 7th has largely been airbrushed from the discussion about the Israel-Hamas war, leaving aside even the failure to internalize what Hamas doesn't hide, that it has no interest in the well-being of the civilians in Gaza. It uses them as human shields. It places them in harm's way. No harm would come to anybody, and this war would be over if Hamas laid down its weapons, released the hostages, and surrendered. It's not doing any of those things. So Israel has not been terribly effective. It's never been terribly effective in articulating its narrative. That's deplorable and regrettable and incomprehensible. But it's not the real problem. The real problem is this soaring intolerance in much of the world for Israel's right to defend itself, the misrepresentation of everything that's been happening here, and the entangling, the connection, the fact that this is essentially now morphed into a staggering spike in anti-Semitism that is impacting everybody in the diaspora and should be incredibly troubling for all decent and fair-minded human beings anywhere.
Experience the power of truth with ILTV News. If you're looking for quality content and captivating visuals, join our news community and become an integral part of our team as we embark on a mission to unveil the real Israel, dismantling the web of lies and misinformation that surround reporting on Israel. By subscribing to ILTV News, you will not only have access to the latest updates, but you will also amplify our message, creating a ripple effect that carries the truth far and wide. Subscribe today and help reshape the narrative. Available on the web, Android, and Apple.
Alon, you've been on the U.S. campuses. I imagine that in normal times, as a leading environmentalist, you would have been welcomed as an Israeli progressive. How is the reception now? Do you need bodyguards?
Well, every campus is born with a little bit of a different character. So there are campuses where not a lot has changed because they're fundamentally a political student body. But when you go to a place like Berkeley, where I spoke a couple of weeks ago, their students describe the Jewish students describe their situation as post-trauma in terms of the fact that there has been a relentless campaign of hatred, of disparagement. I spoke to 50 Jewish students in the Hillel there. It was said that it was the only place on campus they felt safe. They've all been exposed to epithets of dirty Jew and the like, and have been frightened. On February 26th, literally a pogrom took place on that campus where an Israeli speaker was supposed to purr, and a mob of pro-Palestinian students broke windows, broke doors, and the students had to literally escape through an underground little known tunnel. It had all kinds of associations for me. And when I asked the students, what can we do in Israel to help you in these situations? What they said was, these are the people who've stuck it out, have not, taken off their Magen Davids, their Jewish stars, and are sticking with Israel. They said, well, get rid of this government, get rid of Netanyahu. We can't defend this Israeli government, which explains the complexity of defending Israel's right to exist and right to defend itself with a government which is very, very hard to defend for any number of reasons. So, I think the situation on many campuses is extremely challenging to young Jewish students and faculty. I'm at Stanford University most of the time, and there we've had our own share, but their students managed to stand up, have their own tent across from the Palestinians, and provide a model of what really could be done if we had an organized and intrepid campaign.
All right, David, I want to go back to you, change direction slightly, although you did touch on this. After October 7th and those heady days of unity, I had the sense that a real change had occurred that included the ultra-orthodox community. Now the feeling has proven to be just a pipe dream held by many who serve and their families. But it's decision time. The army needs recruits. Netanyahu needs a coalition, and the nation needs a sharing of the burden. Which way is this going?
Well, we could all solve it because everything you said makes sense. I don't think anybody reasonably thinks that 60,000 Haredi young men should be compelled to put on uniforms tomorrow morning. But we need a process, and it should be, I believe it's actually, I've always believed it would be achievable by consensus. But that requires leadership, I'm thinking most especially from the ultra-Orthodox community, that is prepared to have their community shoulder the rights and responsibilities of being Israeli, of living in this country, of enjoying its protection. And why I'm optimistic in principle is because if you speak to people from that community, and my family has a ultra-Orthodox component, and I'm sure, most of our families do, Israelis, right? This is 13% of the population now. Yeah. They're not uniformly anti-taking some role in service in this country. Just look at the levels of volunteerism in the emergency medical services. I'm thinking about Magen David Adom and Hatzalah and so on. Speak to people, they'll tell you. Of course it's fair and makes sense. You have a political leadership that has resisted it, that keeps a community in poverty because, of course, you're not allowed to enter the workforce if you're claiming that you're studying full-time and therefore can't serve in the army. And one of the original proposals in the last few weeks was quite staggeringly from the coalition to raise the age of deferment. So you'd keep the ultra-Orthodox out of employment for even longer because it was so crucial that they not do any form of national service. I mean, this is absurd. And it's, again, as I've said before, Steve, this is not the tradition of Orthodox Judaism. Orthodox Judaism holds that the community should subsidize the best and the brightest to keep Torah study relevant and alive. And the rest of the community, of course, should be providing for their family. That's an Orthodox halachic obligation. And this has become forgotten. You tell that to people who think they are legitimate spokespeople and understand the requirements of Orthodox Judaism. They actually don't even know that. They think that's not true. They think that's some kind of secular lie. It's a betrayal of tradition, and really, we should be able to solve it. I don't see it being solved in the near future. The court is starting to intervene. It's going to become, more and more divisive, and we have so many external enemies, and this is something we could fix from within.
Well, Alon, let's look at the political side of this. Is the ultra-Orthodox draft the issue that will bring down this government? Benny Gantz has been very active on the issue. What is his solution, and will he leave the government if a solution is not found?
In the previous Knesset, the central legislative agenda of our party was this, I think, existential challenge that one of the worst kept secrets in Israel is that about 50% of the people who turn 18 don't go to the army. And what this war has done has taken that 50% of the national, religious, secular, used to be the majority, and shine a light on it. Today, we're short 4,000 soldiers, and it is outrageous that so many Israelis, young people, are giving their lives. So Gantz's proposal was to have a national service for everybody, not just ultra-Orthodox, Arabs as well. And we passed about 5 in a list or a litany of 12 different laws that we need to do to make this a central part of everybody's identity. You don't have to necessarily be a combat soldier. There's so much these communities could benefit from. And in so doing, we would really make the society a much more equal place. I learned one thing since October 7th, and that is in a tough neighborhood like the Middle East, a country cannot survive unless there is a critical mass of young people, men and women, between ages of 18 and, say, 40, who are willing to put their lives on the line. I know when I was of that age, when the war in Lebanon, it was clear to me. But as Israeli young people see such a large percentage, when I was going to the army, maybe the ultra-Orthodox were 3 or 4%. But when you see such a large number of people not getting under the proverbial stretcher, not doing their part, people's motivation is undermined. And our security needs are undermined. So yeah, I think there has to be a change. This is a major fault line in the present coalition. And I do believe that this is the moment when we need to stand firm, if no other reason economic. And I want to just close with this. My students just did an analysis, as Tel Aviv University students, how much does a child in Israel receive in terms of subsidies? And the answer is 37,000 shekels, about $10,000 a year per child. 18-year-old kid has had $180,000. So family with 10 kids, in addition to not shouldering the security burden by staying out of the workforce, isn't making a contribution. As a business model, we can't continue to do that.
David, let me come back to you about the political side. Prime Minister Netanyahu is a very talented politician. He appears to be backed into a corner to keep his coalition together and calls for new elections. He's saying that calls for new elections are a victory for Hamas. Is this government tottering or stable?
Yeah, probably both of those. I don't know which. It's stable in that the people who might, incline to bring it down, I think enough of them probably think they might not get re-elected or it might not work terribly well for them. So, for example, the ultra-Orthodox two parties are very disappointed that Netanyahu prioritized his effort to subjugate the judiciary over legislation that would preserve their being able not to do military service. Therefore, the new law was not passed, and therefore all these petitions in the court gathered momentum, and the court finally last week stepped in to some extent, right? So they're very angry with him, the ultra-orthodox parties. The judicial overhaul largely failed, not completely, and it had terrible consequences, as we've discussed, but they feel he pushed their issues aside. But nobody else is going to give them a better deal. So for all that they're very angry, unless their spiritual leaders somehow impose on the politicians moves that the politicians would not want to take, I don't see them bringing down the government. As Alon has made clear, Benny Gantz doesn't have the votes to bring down the government. He joined a government that already had a majority. He gave it more stability and more, and he brought his worldview and Gadi Eisenkot's worldview and so on. But you're still left with 64, even if Gantz pulls out. So then the question is really whether there are people, I think, within Likud that might be interesting to look at. The most obvious, I don't want to call him a maverick, but the most obvious person in fraught relations with Netanyahu is the defense minister, who's already been fired once and probably assumes he might be fired again and probably doesn't lose sleep over that as much as he loses sleep over October the 7th and everything happening since. So the question, I think, might be to focus on whether Gallant and some, not particularly prominent names maybe in Likud at some point say this is just outrageous and we're doing such terrible harm and we can no longer afford apart from the divisiveness, if that's a word, the sheer dysfunctionality of this coalition. I mean, you couldn't make up the fact that the Knesset is about to go on a recess. It's gone on holiday for a few weeks because it's that time of year. We're in the middle of a war. We've got crises in every direction, not just external, but internal too. You've got tens of thousands of people still internally displaced from the north, and not everybody safely able to return to the south either by any means. The notion that this bloated government should now, and its Knesset members should now go on holiday when the country's in the worst existential crisis it has ever faced, underlines how abysmal the political situation is. And the question then is, are there going to be, it only would take 5 members of the coalition, and I think of the Likud, Gallant and 4 others. I don't see it happening anytime soon. It's Israeli politics. We should have learned in the last few months, if we didn't know before, not to predict anything, not to assess anything that we don't know. But definitely, let me just say one last little thing in terms of some grounds for optimism. I do think that this war and the failure, the political failure and the military failure that enabled Hamas, that helped enable Hamas to invade, will lead to people going into politics and saying, I think more people will stay in the army in important positions. I think some people regret having gone into tech, that everybody left some of the most elite units, and maybe a few more of them should have stayed in the army.
They're telling me we're all out of time. It's been a pleasure to see both of you. It's all the time we have this evening. Thanks to our guests, Alon Tal and David Horowitz. For more of the latest updates from Israel, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter at ILTV.tv. Thanks for watching. Let's win the war and bring them home.